Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Vicki Arroyo, Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center at Georgetown Law. Our Climate Center serves as a resource to states and as a facilitator of the 12 states and the District of Columbia collaborating in the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Last December, TCI jurisdictions issued a statement setting an ambitious goal of designing a proposal for a regional low-carbon transportation program by the end of 2019. And it's our pleasure to update you today after a year of hard work and engagement with many of you. Thanks to everyone who has participated in the process so far and to our funders who make this work possible. Today, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, James Bradbury, to walk you through today's program and to introduce our speakers. James?
Thank you, Vicki, and thanks everybody for joining. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is James Bradbury. It's my honor to introduce a few of the key state officials who've been leading this effort all year. You can learn more about TCI on the website, the link you can see here on the screen in front of you. First, we will hear from Commissioner Marty Suberg, the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Commissioner Suberg is one of the co-chairs of TCI's Executive Policy Committee, which oversees work group activities to help ensure that agency leadership from all participating states have the modeling and materials that they need to make informed decisions. Next, we will hear from Brian Woods, environmental analyst in the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. Brian has been helping to lead the work of the Technical Analysis Work Group, which oversees the modeling and analysis that will be presented for you today. Then we will hear from Chris Hoagland, Program Manager for the Climate Change Program at Maryland's Department of the Environment. Chris is another co-chair for the Technical Analysis Work Group. He will be presenting most of the modeling results that you will see on today's webinar. Also presenting today will be Carrie Enright Cato, Director of the Office of Climate Change Technology and Research at the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Carrie is an active member of the Technical Analysis Work Group and also co-chair for the Investment and Equity Work Group with TCI. So after the presentations, there will be a question and answer session, and two of our consultants will also be on the line to answer questions that are specific to modeling tools that they are running on behalf of the state. So this includes Francis Wood, Director On Location, and Chris Porter, Principal at Cambridge Systematics. So just before handing this over to Commissioner Suberg, for those of you following along this webinar live, we just want to explain how you can participate and get the most out of the conversation. First, we hope you will submit questions through the question or chat box feature and go to webinar interface. You can begin submitting questions at any time throughout the webinar, and I'll be working with my colleague Joe Kruger, Director of Research and Strategy here at Georgetown Climate Center, to read all of your questions. We'll do our best to paraphrase the most common questions we receive, and then we'll ask the speakers to address them during the second half of this webinar. So short and specific questions that are really tied to the subject matter being presented are really best and usually easiest for us to understand and quickly tee up for the speakers. So thanks for your cooperation and interest. Second, I just want to make sure that you're all aware that, like our other webinars and the public meetings that we've facilitated on behalf of TCI so far this year, this webinar is being recorded. So if you miss anything, you can always come back and watch it again at a later date. We'll have the video posted as soon as the transcript is completed and closed captioning is added to the video file. And finally, if you have a comment, and you can always submit those through the TCI input portal, which is available on the TCI website. And with that, Commissioner, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, James, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. I'm Martin Suberg with the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Today, TCI released a draft MOU, which together with the release of these initial modeling results, marks an important milestone for our ongoing effort to propose a regional low-carbon transportation program. 1 year ago, following a series of 6 regional listening sessions and other outreach, TCI jurisdictions issued a statement committing to design, by the end of 2019, a regional low-carbon transportation policy proposal. That program is being designed to cap carbon dioxide emissions from transportation and generate proceeds that each jurisdiction can invest in programs to transition to a more sustainable, resilient, lower carbon transportation sector, and to provide residents with more transportation options, improved air quality and public health, as well as economic opportunity. Over the past 12 months, the jurisdictions have engaged in an intensive process of public engagement, technical consultation, and program analysis. More on this in a couple of minutes. Today, we're fulfilling the commitment by releasing the draft MOU to guide the next steps towards the establishment of a regional program. The draft MOU builds on the framework we released on October 1st, 2019, and incorporates additional detail about the policy while clarifying the steps the jurisdictions will take after an MOU is finalized in the spring of 2020. Like the October framework, this draft MOU is being made public today to give people and organizations across the region an opportunity to provide additional feedback. We encourage everyone who is interested to provide your input on the modeling findings and the draft MOU to inform our final program design. A final MOU is expected in the spring of 2020. At that time, each of the 13 jurisdictions will decide whether to sign the final MOU and participate in the regional program. The slide shows a brief outline of today's webinar. Before diving into the modeling results, a few minutes of context. First, Brian and I will explain why states from Virginia to Maine and the District of Columbia are pursuing this important and ambitious effort, and how we got to where we are today, beginning with the listening sessions in 2018. Next, Chris will present the modeling results in several parts, beginning with an introduction to the tools that we are using, and an explanation of our reference case and underlying assumptions, building on webinars that TCI hosted this past spring and summer. Next, Chris will describe how the cap reduction policy cases were modeled. Carrie from Connecticut will jump in to explain investment assumptions that were used. Chris will walk through all of the results from cap reduction scenarios, the macroeconomic modeling, and the preliminary health benefit analysis that was conducted at the regional level. And then I'll wrap things up with a summary of what's next for the modeling and TCI's regional policy development process in general. Then we'll have 30 to 45 minutes for discussion, and we're excited to receive your feedback and questions. Bipartisan leadership working together on climate change, air pollution, and clean transportation is essential. This is regional action to address regional opportunities. We have an opportunity to address greatest challenges together. As the slide shows, 52 million vehicles are registered in the TCI jurisdictions, representing a market equivalent to 1.75 times California's. 72 million people in the population, 1/5 of the population of the United States. A gross domestic a GDP of 5.3 trillion, which is just shy of the German and French economies combined. Any one regional policy is not going to be a silver bullet. States and localities and the federal government all need to do more to achieve our climate and clean transportation goals. A cap and invest approach has the benefit of ensuring that fuel suppliers operating within participating jurisdictions are all paying the same amount for pollution allowances. This simplifies things for businesses with compliance obligations, and it creates a level playing field, which contributes to the sense that of interstate cooperation on shared regional initiatives that require investment. These include electric vehicle charging infrastructure, improved multimodal transit, and more sustainable freight movement. Since transportation is responsible for more than 40% of the global warming pollution in the TCI region, we will need to implement bold initiatives to mitigate the impact of GHG emissions from the transportation sector. As the electric power sector in our region has become cleaner, the percentage from transportation has continued to grow. Each of the TCI jurisdictions have established goals for cutting carbon pollutions, and in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and several other states, those goals are binding legislative requirements. The TCI jurisdictions have been and will continue to listen to input from the public. The draft MOU has been informed by extensive consultation and input from public participation at the regional level and in each TCI jurisdiction. at workshops in TCI jurisdictions, on webinars, and through submissions through the TCI online portal. People have provided extensive input on nearly every aspect of a regional low-carbon transportation policy. We encourage this dialogue as we head into spring 2020. In terms of specific policy solutions, the regional policy idea that most groups of participants raised and discussed was some variant on cap and invest, generally through investment, through carbon taxes or pricing pollution, a price on carbon. The TCI jurisdictions have been listening and will continue to listen to people. The draft MOU has been informed by extensive consultation and input from public participation at the regional level and in each TCI jurisdiction. Over the past 12 months, the TCI jurisdictions have engaged in an extensive process of public engagement, technical consultation, and program analysis. More than 1,000 people took part in 3 regional workshops and webinars this year, and hundreds more have taken part in events organized in each of the TCI jurisdictions. The online TCI input portal has received more than 1,200 submissions for individuals, companies, and organizations. All input has informed our work to date, and we encourage you to continue participating in this process and providing this valuable input. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brian Woods.
Good afternoon, everyone. Brian Woods, Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, Air Quality and Climate Division. Commissioner Suberg touched on the scale of the opportunity for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. I'm going to briefly highlight the co-benefits of the program that my colleagues Chris and Kerry will discuss in more detail shortly. The transition to cleaner transportation choices reduces emissions of all motor vehicle pollutants, including carcinogenic volatile organic compounds and fine particulates that can result in or aggravate respiratory illnesses. The program will result in improvements in regional air quality and a reduction in the recurrence of respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, particularly for children, seniors, and those with impaired respiratory systems. The figure at the bottom right of the page illustrates how traffic-related air pollution is generally concentrated along roadways. This is a study depicting concentrations of pollutants next to a roadway. The freeway is in the red oval, and you can see that the concentration of pollutants is nearby and downwind. And those are places where people that live near those areas or in those areas where there's a lot of traffic can be exposed to these pollutants. In addition to addressing this issue, the program also enable additional development of infrastructure such as sidewalks and dedicated bike lanes to encourage safe active transit. And that's an activity that simultaneously decreases emissions and improves health. In cities and rural areas, lower income communities often have less access to good transportation choices. The opportunity to address pollution is also an opportunity to address equity of access, to make it easier for people to travel to work, school, and healthcare services, and to build more vibrant economies and communities. In addition, the states will be able to continue to improve and expand cleaner, reliable, and affordable transportation options for everybody, with a focus on serving community members who would benefit the most. This includes transition to lower emitting vehicles, service expansion, non-traditional options such as car sharing, ride sharing, and on-demand services, and in the longer term, continuing development of walk and bike-friendly communities that reduce the necessity for car trips or even vehicle ownership. The upshot is that investments in cleaner transportation made possible by this program result in an overall economic benefit to the region through increased economic activity, lower vehicle operating and maintenance costs, and avoided negative health outcomes. As you will see shortly, the modeled impact is small in the scale of the overall regional economy, but it is positive.
Okay, so this is Chris Hoagland from Maryland. I'll walk us through the modeling from here. Thanks, Brian. I'll go over an overview of the modeling approach we took, and then I'll walk everyone through some revised reference case results for 2022 through 2032. Since we presented reference case results back in August, we made a couple of improvements. So the results you'll see today are very slightly different from the ones in August. And then I'll walk through the work we've done evaluating the potential policy implications of 3 different emission cap scenarios. Those would be the impacts on energy use and emissions from transportation, public health, and the economy. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of the steps we've taken. So first was developing reference case assumptions. Many of you will recall we held a webinar on that topic, solicited input from the public on what those assumptions should be. Then we ran the reference case. The reference case, as a reminder, is a scenario in the model where the cap and invest program does not exist. It's our business as usual estimate, where there's no cap and invest program, but everything else that's relevant to the transportation sector that's happening in the world is still happening. So we ran that reference case. We held a webinar on it. We solicited input on that reference case. Then in step 3, we revised the reference case to the results you'll see today. And then the next step was, once we had that reference case, we ran scenarios with different emissions caps. These refer to these sometimes as policy scenarios. And in these, we take that reference case and we add the TCI policy, and we see how outcomes change due to that policy. The next step, using the results of that analysis, we conducted macroeconomic and initial public health analysis, and we'll go over those results today. And then where we are today is that final item, releasing these modeling results and asking for more input on these policy scenarios that we're presenting today. Next slide, please. So those of you who watched the prior webinars would also recall that we've identified sort of 4 major questions to address with our modeling tools. The ones at the top are on the left: how does the cap affect the transportation sector? And very closely related is, how do the investments affect the transportation sector? This is a cap and invest program, so both the cap and the investments affect outcomes, and they also interact with one another in terms of how those outcomes are expressed in the transportation sector. And then after accounting for the dynamics between the cap and the investments, we then explore what are the impacts from the program, what are the economic benefits, what are the public health benefits, and then we explore in more detail how those benefits and costs are distributed. We'll be focusing on the 3 questions on the top, and then the one on the lower left today. Additional steps of analysis will give us more on the lower right question about how benefits and costs are distributed. Next slide, please. So I won't go through this in detail. This is a lot of information we've talked about in the prior webinars, but this just shows which analytical tools we have available to answer those questions on the prior slide, and they sort of correspond to those questions. We'll be talking about impacts or results from the TCI NEMS model, which is our transportation sector model, where we model the cap, and the investment strategy tool, which we draw upon to analyze the impact of the investments that the cap and invest program would enable. And then on the lower left, we'll be talking about some results from the REMI tool, which is how we analyze macroeconomic impacts. And then we also have some initial public health results that do not come from the health impacts model mentioned there. That's a next step, as well as the incidence model on the lower right that will do some household level analysis. Next slide, please. So for the TCI NEMS energy system model, so NEMS stands for National Energy Modeling System. It's a federal government model. A federal government model is used by the Energy Information Administration. On location, Francis Wood is on the line, adapted that model for use by the TCI states by changing the geography to match the TCI region. And so within this TCI NEMS model are 3 subregions. There's the Northeast, colored in green here, the Mid-Atlantic in yellow, and the Upper South Atlantic in blue. And these correspond to the census regions that are built into the NEMS model. Next slide, please. And I guess for more on how the models work and how we constructed them, I'll refer you to the prior webinars, which as James said, are recorded and posted on transportationandclimate.org. We went into a lot of detail about how these things work. So for the reference case, as I mentioned earlier, the analysis process begins with a reference case, which explores what would happen in the absence of the cap and invest program. we are focusing our analysis on the time period 2022 through 2032. In the draft MOU, you'll see that the earliest a program like this could begin would be 2022. And so by looking at it from 2022 through 2032, we would capture about a decade of declining caps starting in the second year of the program. We proposed assumptions for the reference case, as I mentioned earlier, on a webinar in May. Then we presented initial results in August. Since then, we've revised our assumptions about non-battery costs of electric vehicles. This is the balance of costs of producing an electric vehicle other than the battery. Those are revised, and so this is the new reference case that we'll be talking about here. The results are slightly different. Next slide, please. So these are the key assumptions. I'm not going to talk about these in detail. You'll have access to these materials. We discussed all of these item by item in the prior webinars, but this is for your reference to see what our data sources were and our assumptions for a number of important factors in the modeling. Next slide, please. Okay, so some reference case results. This slide shows the composition of light-duty vehicle sales. Light-duty vehicles are cars and light trucks, think pickup trucks. This graph here shows annual sales of new vehicles across the TCI region, the 13 jurisdictions, and the colors in each bar represent the composition of new vehicles being sold in that year. Blue is conventional gasoline, and those warm colors ranging from yellow and orange, those are plug-in hybrids and full electric vehicles. And you'll see that over time, due to the improving existing vehicle standards, as well as the declining cost of electric vehicle technology, in a reference case without a TCI program, the model shows growing use of these electric vehicles to the point where in 2032, roughly 30% of light-duty vehicle sales are electric or plug-in hybrid. Next slide, please. So as that last graph showed the composition of new cars hitting the road, this graph shows the composition of all the vehicles being driven by on roads by all of the vehicles, new and existing. And so as sales of EVs grow, increasing the total share of EVs across the fleet, they start to make up a growing share of the miles that are being driven on the roads. Up to about 13% of all miles driven on the road from light-duty vehicles are electric or plug-in hybrid in 2032. Next slide. Again, this is all still the reference case. So this shows emissions from motor gasoline and on-road diesel on the left, and consumption of motor gasoline and on-road diesel on the right. The different lines represent the subregions, with the red line at the top being the TCI region as a whole. So in the reference case, the model projects that the CO2 emissions from motor gasoline and on-road diesel will fall roughly 19% from 2022 through 2032. Largely due to improved fuel economy in vehicles due to vehicle standards and increasing use of electric vehicles in response to policies that are existing to incentivize their use, as well as the falling costs of the electric vehicle technology and the resulting vehicles. Next slide. However, that's a very uncertain outcome. So we have started to perform sensitivity analysis, which has been a topic on these prior webinars. Sensitivity analysis is when we vary some of the variables that affect the outcomes in the model that are not a policy, or not the policy in question here. So we performed some sensitivity analysis on oil prices and federal policies. So the solid black line on this graph is that reference case with the 19% reduction in emissions. That shaded area and the different colored lines represent the range of different emissions outcomes we saw in this sensitivity analysis, where we either put in lower oil price projections from EIA, or we analyze what would happen if the federal government rolls back vehicle fuel economy standards as has been proposed. All of those would result in emissions being higher and emission reductions being less, to the point where under business as usual, we may only see about a 6% decline in emissions from 2022 through 2032 instead of a 19% decline, which would make it harder to achieve our greenhouse gas reduction goals. But policy actions by states, including Cap and Invest program, could help lock in the needed reductions. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Carrie from Connecticut to talk about how we modeled investments.
Great, thanks, Chris. This is Carrie Enriquedo from the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. In the next couple slides, I'll provide you with an overview of the illustrative investment scenarios we used in the policy scenarios we ran. So to develop the illustrative scenario, we elected to use a transportation investment modeling tool as a supplement to the TCI NEMS tool that Chris mentioned earlier, which, like most integrated energy modeling tools, does not have the ability to directly simulate low carbon transportation strategies such as VMT or vehicle mile travel changes from the expansion of mass transit and bike or pedestrian infrastructure. This investment modeling tool was developed by Cambridge Systematics, built using data and information from various published research. So while this tool generates very reasonable estimates of emissions and VMT reductions that could result from the investments of proceeds from a TCI regional program, in reality, the effectiveness of infrastructure projects at reducing emissions can be very location and project specific. Next slide, please. So now taking a closer look at the illustrative scenario we used. As you're all aware, in order to model the effects of a cap and invest program, you have to choose the cap levels you want to assess. In addition to this, you also have to make assumptions about how the proceeds from the program will be invested. However, I think it's important to emphasize, for the purpose of this modeling exercise, the TCI jurisdictions developed an illustrative clean transportation investment portfolio to feed into the model, which is described here on the slide. In an operational regional program, each jurisdiction will determine how to invest its portion of the allowance auction proceeds to meet the needs of its people, communities, and businesses. Every state is different and will make its own determination considering public input. Investment decisions always involve balancing among multiple benefits and considerations. So this scenario includes investments in a broad range of options, with a larger portion of the proceeds going to strategies that deliver the most cost-effective reductions in carbon emissions. So with that, I'll turn it back to Chris.
Thanks, Carrie. So this slide shows the scenarios that we ran through the model. So all of these scenarios are exploring a regional CO2 cap that starts at the emissions in 2022 and then reduces by a particular percentage between 2022 and 2032. So we've shown the reference case here at the top of this table. As I said, that showed a 19% reduction over that time period. But when we performed our sensitivity analysis, including the rollback of federal vehicle standards and lower oil prices, we sometimes saw as low as a 6% decrease over that time period. And then the three lines on the bottom half there are the three cap scenarios that we analyzed and we're presenting today. One with a 20% reduction in the carbon cap from 2022 through 2032, one with a 22% reduction, and one with a 25% reduction. Next slide. So this shows the emissions results under those different caps and the reference case. The shaded area and the black line are the same as we saw on the prior slide about the reference case. That represents the range of potential outcomes without the policy. And the colorful lines are the emissions under these three different caps. The 20% reduction cap in purple, 22% reduction cap in light blue, and 25% reduction cap in green. All of these caps would lock in those decreases in carbon dioxide we expect through 2032, despite any of the factors that may prevent those decreases from occurring. And then they would achieve incremental reductions beyond that. So the emissions decline across the region in these scenarios is roughly following the level prescribed by each cap. The 20% reduction, 22% reduction, 25% reduction. We've incorporated a flexibility mechanism that's standard in these programs called allowance banking in our analysis, and the result is that there's a slightly slower rate of decline than that in later years because of allowance banking and how the model balances costs across time. It's a very small difference. Next slide, please. And sorry, still on this one. So if you go back real quick. So the reductions that we see in the CO2 in these scenarios are driven by the investments we've made in fostering greater choice for clean transportation options, as well as the incentive provided by a carbon price for consumers and businesses to take advantage of those clean transportation options. So this slide shows the resulting allowance prices, and annual proceeds. The general pattern you see in a cap and invest program is that the more stringent the cap, the greater emission reductions it requires, the higher the resulting allowance price. The allowance price is the carbon price. It's the price it's dollars per ton of carbon covered under the program. And so you can see that in the scenarios with the more stringent cap declines, the allowance price is higher. That also translates into higher annual proceeds for states to invest in clean transportation options. The range of proceeds we saw in this analysis started in 2022, is that bullet in the upper left. It starts at $1.4 billion in the 20% case, ranging up to $5.6 billion available for the states to invest in the 25% case. And these allowance prices reflect the combined effect of the cap and the investments, both of which reduce emissions. And as I mentioned earlier, more stringent caps result in greater proceeds available for investment. Next slide, please. So for fuel prices, you're looking at two graphs here. The one on the left shows the variation over the last 10 years in gas prices relative to the gas price in 2019. So in each year, that shows how much more or less expensive gasoline was in that year compared to 2019. And you'll see that over the last decade, the gas prices varied, from roughly $1 less expensive to $1.50 more expensive than it is today, to set the context for the historical variation we see in gasoline prices. And the graph on the right on the same scale shows the projected change in gasoline prices in these policy scenarios. And that change reflects that if the covered entities in this program, the regulated entities, the fuel suppliers, decide to pass on the allowance price to consumers, it would mean incremental price increases in 2022 of 5 cents per gallon, 9 cents per gallon, and 17 cents per gallon in the 20%, 22%, and 25% scenarios, respectively. So in all of the scenarios we modeled, that change in gas prices was smaller than the typical variation we see in gasoline prices. That's driven, by factors like the balance of supply and demand in global oil markets. The range we saw from this program was smaller than that, even in only individual years. For example, the change from 2017 to 2018. And so one of the opportunities that a program like this could provide, and the investments in clean transportation options, would be to reduce the exposure of our economies to these substantial existing variations in the gas price, and also companion policies that reduce fuel consumptions, such as, for example, more ambitious federal and state vehicle standards would moderate those costs even further. Next slide, please. So this is a sort of a summary table of many of the outputs. Again, these materials will be available, so you don't have to write all of these down right now. But it shows from left to right outcomes in the reference case, which is there is no cap and there is no investments. And in the 20%, 22%, and 25% cap scenarios, we're showing numbers in both 2022 and 2032 for each of those scenarios. And then from top to bottom, we're looking at total emissions in million metric tons of carbon dioxide and the percent reduction achieved from 2022 through 2032. The next row shows allowance prices in 2022 and 2032. These are dollars per metric ton, and these are 2017 dollars, so ignoring inflation. And the next row shows how that translates into total annual proceeds in billions of dollars per year in 2022 and 2032 at the different cap levels. The monetized public health benefits in the preliminary analysis we'll be talking about more shortly. In 2032 for each of those cap scenarios, and the avoided climate impacts in, again, billions of dollars in 2032 in each of those cap scenarios. Next slide. And the general conclusion here is that as the cap gets more stringent, the emissions reductions and benefits go up. So Carrie is going to talk a little bit more about some of the alternate investment scenarios we explored in the analysis.
Great, thanks, Chris. So in order to better understand how different investment portfolios might differently influence program outcomes, we ran, in addition to the investment scenario we reviewed earlier, two more illustrative investment scenarios as represented in column A and C. Scenario B, which is highlighted in the center column, the blue column, is the main scenario that we reviewed on slide 22 and was used in the 3 policy cases. So as you can see, they each give different weights to different types of investment strategies. And the next slide will review the results. So this slide shows the investment scenario results comparing the 3 investment scenarios for the 25% cap reduction policy case. What we can glean from this comparison is that the investments in low carbon transportation programs make it easier to meet the cap. This is particularly true when investments are targeted toward the most cost-effective strategies, i.e. the more tons reduced per dollar invested. For example, Scenario C, in which investments were somewhat narrowly targeted toward cost-effective emission reduction strategies, resulted in lower allowance prices. Before handing the baton back over to Chris, I'll just note that the investment Scenario B is the illustrative portfolio used as a basis for the economic and health benefit analysis, which Chris will now explain.
Thanks, Carrie. So we used, for the macroeconomic impacts, we used a model called REMI. This is a dynamic model of the regional economy that considers how changes in monetary flows throughout the economy among industry sectors and consumers can affect outcomes. The model covers the 12 states and DC, the 13 jurisdictions participating in TCI, and it includes 23 industry sectors. And this is an industry standard model for evaluating macroeconomic impacts. Next slide, please. So for an overview of the results we're presenting, we're showing some inputs and outputs for the 3 policy cases. And the illustrative investment scenario, you'll recall there were annual investments ranging from $1.6 billion to $6.25 billion. That's compared to the reference case where there were no investments at all. The changes represent combined outputs from both the NEMS tool and the TCI investment modeling tool that evaluated the combined impacts of the cap and the associated investments. So we're going to show you impacts through 2032 and also after 2032, the reason being that many of those investments that we're exploring in clean transportation infrastructures are long-term investments. So what we analyzed was a cap and invest program through 2032, and then we continue to evaluate the economic benefits after 2032 from sort of the trailing range of benefits and some of the long-term investments that we made through 2032. Next slide, please. So some key findings. Generally, businesses and individuals can save money from reduced fuel expenditures, lower congestion from investments in transportation infrastructure, and lower vehicle and operating and maintenance costs, in particular from using electric vehicles. The costs of the policy, the fuel impacts we saw earlier, are small relative to the economic growth we're seeing. And the net result is that in our macroeconomic analysis, we see positive, though modest impacts on region-wide GDP, income, and jobs. These are all positive numbers in 2032, and then when you look across the broader time frame, capturing the greater period in which the benefits of these long-term investments would accrue, they're even more substantially positive. Next slide, please. So now we're going to show tables. Again, you'll have these materials, so you don't need to write down all these numbers. Scenario by scenario, showing this table shows the first several rows are GDP increases in the year 2032, in the year 2040, and in average across the time period from 2022 through 2040. So just walking you through this table, like I said, the top several rows are GDP. So there's the increase in billions of dollars. There's the percentage that increase represents compared to the reference case. Effectively, this is, for example, a $1.4 billion increase in GDP. How big is that compared to the size of the region's economy? So that's what that percentage represents. And then again, that reference case GDP, just showing the size of the economy these impacts are acting upon. And then disposable personal income, those impacts are also positive across cases in the year 2032, year 2040, and average across 22 through 2040, and the increase in employment. Again, positive in the range of thousands of jobs, and shown as a portion of total, or compared to total employment across the region in the percentages. So this is for the 20% cap reduction scenario. The next slide will show the 22%. The key is that the numbers all go up. And then the next slide is the 25%. Again, the numbers go up. So so what we've seen is in all three of these scenarios, there are economic benefits in the order of billions of dollars and thousands of additional jobs, and those benefits grow over time as we continue to invest in clean transportation infrastructure and options that generate long-term benefits. Next slide, please. So we're also performed a preliminary analysis of health benefits. Those of you who've been following the conversation know that there's a multi-university team led by Harvard that's going to construct very detailed, or it's going to perform very detailed public health analysis, including at a relatively fine geographic scale, the county level. What we're presenting here today is a more preliminary analysis. It's just at the regional level, performed by Cambridge Systematics. We, just for illustrative purposes, performed this analysis in the year 2032. So shown here at the bottom of the screen are the range of potential impacts in 2032, the range representing impacts from the 20% versus the 25% scenario. The impacts from the 22% scenario are in between. So in 2032, avoided premature deaths between 300 and 1,000. Between 338 and 1,300, 1,400 fewer incidents of asthma, between 450 and 1,700 fewer injuries from traffic accidents, and the total monetized benefits from those impacts in 2032. Again, this is just in the year 2032, range from $3 to $10 billion. These come from three primary changes. This is improved public health from reduced air pollution. Improved public health from increased physical activity from the investments in sidewalks and bike lanes, for example, and benefits for improved safety from several of the investments. So we'll break down those impacts from those three different categories next. In the next slide, shows the benefits from the reduced air pollution. So transportation sources are major contributors of ozone and particulate matter pollution. The carbon cap and investments in clean transportation would reduce the amounts of those co-pollutants. This is like I said earlier, very preliminary region-wide analysis. Since many of these benefits are concentrated in areas that have air quality problems and are along roadways, this is likely conservative. The benefits would be higher. So you'll see here in this table, we have estimates of the reductions in the various pollutants, PM2.5, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, and NOx, nitrogen oxides, and the resulting avoided premature deaths, avoided asthma symptoms, and the monetized value of that air pollution reduction for the 20%, 22%, and 25% caps. And that's in millions of dollars there. So these are large numbers. Next slide. So that was the benefits from the cleaner air. This is the benefits from physical activity. One of the investment categories is in sidewalks and protected bike lanes, other investments that make it easier to walk or bike where you need to go. That both improve safety by reducing number of vehicles on the road, and also yields significant health benefits from the improved physical activity. So you can see impacts here: avoided deaths in the year 2032, ranging from 270 up to 877, and the monetization of that, which is the statistical value of lives saved, ranging from $2.5 billion up to $8.4 billion in 2032. Next slide. And the third component in the health analysis is safety. So many of the investments in clean transportation options that we've explored that expand transportation choices reduce the number of vehicles on the road, which can reduce traffic-related incidents. So we have estimates for the number of deaths avoided, the number of injuries avoided, and the monetization of that in millions of dollars. Next slide. So that was all preliminary. We'll be looking forward to more thorough analysis in early 2020 from Harvard. So general conclusions from the macroeconomic and public health modeling: applying a declining emissions cap could lock in the reductions we hope to see through 2032, and then drive additional reductions beyond that. The The program that we've modeled would have a modest but positive impact on GDP, on personal income, and on jobs, and those would be substantially net positive over the time frame we've modeled. And there would be also significant benefits to public health. Although when you add up the monetary benefit of public health, that exceeds the annual investments that we're making. And so the overall conclusion here is that we can deploy a cap and invest program here to make really significant progress toward our climate goals by reducing carbon dioxide pollution and other air pollutants at modest cost and even, in fact, at net benefit to our economy. And I believe Commissioner Suberg will take over from here.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for walking us through the results of the modeling done to date and summarizing that on that slide. Just before we open it up to your questions and comments, a little bit on next steps. As we noted, the public input will continue to be welcome and encouraged through the TCI online portal. The link to do that is on the screen right now. Please provide input by February 28th, 2020. On modeling, we'll be conducting additional sensitivity analysis to reflect uncertainties and inform the design of stability mechanisms. For example, how higher or lower gas prices could affect regional programs. More detailed modeling on benefits for public health is underway by a multi-university team led by Harvard C-Change. You've heard a little bit about that work in Chris's presentation, and if you attended the TCI workshops earlier this year in Boston and Baltimore. We'll look forward to seeing those results in the spring, in addition to results from the incident modeling led by Resources for the Future, which will help us evaluate potential benefits and costs of a regional program for households in urban and rural areas. These efforts will help us to better understand the potential equity implications of the regional program. I want to emphasize again how valuable your input has been and how much we're looking forward to ongoing feedback and dialogue on the draft MOU and the modeling that we're releasing today. We'll continue to host meetings, webinars, and other events to allow for an open dialogue about how to best craft a regional transportation policy that works for everyone while helping us to achieve needed emission reduction goals. Now I'll turn this back over to James and to Joe Kruger to read your questions and initiate the discussion part of this webinar.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, and all the other state officials for your remarks and for walking through those slides. So for everyone on the line, you can enter your questions. We've already received a lot, but you can go ahead and enter those in the chat or question box on the GoToWebinar, and we'll work through. And we'll work with our speakers to get through as many as possible before we run out of time at 4. So we still have some time here to get through those, and hope you can stick around. The slide, of course, you're looking at now lists the speakers for reference. This is, again, James Bradbury speaking. We also have a couple of our consultants on the line, Francis Wood and Chris Porter. And again, I'm here with Joe Kruger. You'll hear his voice in a moment. When we get to, we'll be alternating probably with our questions. So let's just get straight into it then. I think one thing I just want to make, we had a couple questions just sort of right up front. Have the governors signed on to this draft MOU? And I think Marty addressed that, Commissioner Suberg, sorry, addressed that point in his remarks, but I just want to be crystal clear that this is a draft MOU and the states would make a decision regarding whether or not to sign on in the spring when the final MOU is released. Also, there have been several questions about when these slides will be posted. They'll be posted immediately after this webinar. On the web page, you should have access to a 3-page executive summary, which includes some of these materials already, but in about 40 minutes, you'll have access to the slide deck that we're walking through today. So I think for the first question, I was going to get into EVs. There are a lot of questions in electric vehicles and interest in electric vehicles and the modeling of electric vehicles. So we do have actually a couple slides on that subject in the appendix, and so I think maybe we'll start there So I think there's a question of what about the levels of electric vehicle deployment would be expected under the different policy scenarios. Chris Hoagland, would you like to take this? And I think Drew will bring that slide up for you, my colleague Drew.
Sure. Yeah, great. So perhaps slide 48. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so the general conclusion is that light-duty EV deployments would increase in response to the allowance price, the carbon price that provides greater incentive to adopt that technology, as well as the investments that would enable by the states in incentives to purchase electric vehicles and in sort of additional spending that could encourage their use. These 4 lines here show the annual share of light-duty vehicle sales that are from EVs. You'll recall in the reference case, which is the solid black line here, it was about 30% in 2032. So you see that in the 3 cap scenarios we evaluated, that number effectively goes up as soon as the program is in place and enabling investments in EV incentives.
Thanks, Chris. I wasn't sure if we could show the next slide as well. Is that possible? Oh, okay. Go ahead. Did you want to say anything else about this, Chris?
Yeah. So that last slide shows the share of annual sales. This shows the sort of the composition of the resulting stock, which takes time as as the new vehicles has an increasing share of new vehicles or EVs. That will more slowly increase the existing stock as vehicles turn over. New vehicles, those new vehicles replace older vehicles. So this shows that by increasing the sales of EVs, the adoption of EVs and new car sales, that also increases their share of the overall light-duty vehicle stock across the region, which increases over time and increases with the more stringent cap scenarios.
Thank you, Chris. Actually, just one quick follow-up, and I think maybe Francis could speak to this, but there were a couple of questions about federal policy and electric vehicle incentives, and just what are the assumptions in the reference case regarding federal electric vehicle incentives?
Sure. This is Francis Wood. So as the questioner probably knows, there's a current tax credit available at the federal level that's related to battery size, capping up at $7,500 a vehicle. And good, you brought up the slide that shows an estimate of how we anticipate that federal credit to expire. The law is written in such a way that there's a phase out for each manufacturer as they approach sales of 200,000 vehicles. So looking at projections of vehicle sales, the graph here illustrates that by 2025, essentially, we expect that the federal tax credit will have phased out.
Great, thank you. Thanks. I think Joe's going to take the next question.
Yeah, several questions came in about equity considerations, and more specifically, how does the modeling inform equity considerations, including how communities may experience changes in air quality and disproportionately affected populations and demographics. That's sort of both a modeling question, but also sort of more kind of a program philosophy and framework and goals perspective. So I'll just throw that to either Marty or Chris initially.
This is Marty. I'll start, and I'll allow, if all right, I'll go first, and if Chris would like to talk specifically about the modeling issues, I think you're right. We are taking equity very seriously. As you might have noticed in the October 1st framework, equity is the very first section. It reflects our recognition and commitment to the goals of equity, environmental justice, and meaningful public participation. We're listening to a lot of points of view, and trying to make sure that we are capturing all the important elements of equity. And it goes to both program design as well as investments. And we're looking at, obviously, not only ways to reduce transportation emissions throughout the region, but how we can best invest in programs that benefit communities, and particularly communities that have been overburdened. because as we noted in this presentation, the benefit of this program is not simply greenhouse gas emissions, but it is the elimination of transportation-related pollutants in those communities. And so it's important to make sure we have program design right. It's important to make sure that we have investments well thought out to reflect the different needs of different communities, and that's why our engagement efforts are so important and ongoing. And it's also important with respect to complementary policies, which is an element of our program. CAP and INVEST is an important program, but it needs to work in concert and in coordination with other programs. At some of our sessions, we've heard about things like old truck phase-outs, targeted at at-risk communities where small businesses have a harder time getting credit to replace older trucks. Innovation in shared ride services and non-transportation-related service such as high-speed internet. Incentives for lower-income drivers to replace older, high-polluting vehicles with more efficient, cleaner, zero or near-zero emission cars. Port electrification initiatives. These are just some of the things we heard, and we are going to continue to take that input as we shape the program. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris on the issue of on how that has been reflected in the modeling work we've done and plan to do going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Suberg. I think those are good points. And in the context of the modeling, modeling is one source of information on this issue, but of course there are really important other sources of information, like direct conversations with affected communities. But in the modeling, what we've seen is that the CAP and INVEST program would result in emission reductions, including of the air pollutants that cause local air quality problems. But in that illustrative investment scenario that Carrie described, we analyzed what that would translate into just in terms of on the ground actual deployment of clean transportation solutions in communities. And so through 2032, for example, in the 25% CAP scenario, we're talking about deploying as many as 44,000 electric transit buses across the region, ensuring that the buses serving different communities are emissions-free, which would improve the local air quality. Similar for electric school buses, up to 42,000 of those deployed through 2032 in that scenario, which would directly benefit the children, especially who would otherwise be exposed to the diesel exhaust, and up to $1 billion annually in investments in bus service and transit improvements, safety upgrades at stops, and investments in making the service more reliable. Marty, you had mentioned trucks. In some communities, truck traffic is a really major source of air pollution, and in that scenario, that 25% scenario, we were deploying up to 84,000 electric trucks across the region, turning those diesel engines into electric motors that would not produce any local emissions. And then, the investments in bike lanes and sidewalks and other local transportation upgrades could be really beneficial things for affected communities. At this point, our public health analysis was preliminary and just region-wide, so those are sort of abstract and region-wide. But through additional steps in the analysis, we'll be looking at how those impacts could translate into sort of more specific places. But generally, the modeling we performed so far indicates that we could do really good things in communities across the region.
Thanks, Chris. And I think that's actually a good segue too. We've had a lot of questions and a lot of interest in better understanding the different investment scenarios and what's under the hood, pun intended, sorry. Relatedly, people wanting to understand how the different investment portfolios would result in such different carbon prices given the same cap level in those scenarios. So I think maybe there are a couple slides that we could maybe show on this to inform this. And I think one questioner, wanted to understand related impact on impact of EV deployment related to emissions. But one thing I wanted to clarify, there are a lot of questions about freight and why freight isn't covered. But just to be clear, the program, the proposal is to cover on-road diesel and motor gasoline. And so that would cover freight and trucks. So that would be included. And again, I think investments could be a big way of addressing that. So I think we have a slide here to inform that. So perhaps, Carrie, you could say a word or two about the thinking behind the investment scenarios and what's involved.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I would want to reiterate that the investment scenario that's on the screen is really a example investment strategy. Each state will have the ability to invest their proceeds as their community needs are put in front of them. But if you look a little closer at that 30% electric cars, light trucks, and vans, it describes what that means. And in the other scenarios that we talked through, you see less investment in electrification, which results in lower emissions reductions across the region. So this electrification, that you see in this strategy is a cost-effective emissions reductions that lead to more emissions reductions in that 2022 to 2030 timeframe. I don't know if Chris Porter from Cambridge Systematics wants to add any more detailed information on the actual investment tool.
Yeah, I mean, we have estimates of cost effectiveness for each one of the strategies that we look at, and they do vary somewhat. As Carrie mentioned, electrification tends to be one of the more cost-effective strategies looking at it from a greenhouse gas emission reduction standpoint. But there are other strategies in the tool, such as transit investment, pedestrian, and bicycle, maybe that don't get you as much emission reductions per dollar, but they also have important transportation benefits. So, there's different reasons that kind of states might consider different mixes of strategies.
Right, and the slide that we just pulled up here, it goes to the question of why, with the same cap level, do you get such different carbon prices out of the model, and it goes to that cost effectiveness point that Carrie and Chris were just making. And on the previous slide, it lays out the different scenarios. You can see that the scenario C, which has the lowest carbon prices, is also more heavily weighted toward those strategies that are most cost effective in the near term, and that's those electrification measures, and also pedestrian and bike infrastructure, for example, also something that can be done quickly to reduce VMT. Does anyone else want to add anything in response to that? Great, I'll kick it over. Joe's going to ask the next question.
Great. So several questions about the cap levels or the scenarios that have been presented and the level of program ambition. And I guess they sort of boil down to, are these the only cap levels that TCI is considering? And several of the questions are, why only a 25% reduction by 2032? Marty, I'll kick that to you.
Okay, thanks. It's important to highlight two things. First of all, at this time, we are not proposing a specific cap level. We felt like this was important information to provide so people could understand the information and the analysis we're working on. The second point is we welcome public input on the stringency of the program. We're still doing work on modeling to better inform our decisions. We look forward to hearing from people about stringency and other aspects of the program. I will say that I do think that the modeling that has been provided is already providing us a great deal of information as states, think about how we get started. How do we work together to get a program that is well understood and well thought out, and that is designed to guarantee that we get the reductions that we need and have been discussed both in the reference case and in some of the policy cases. It's important that we move forward with a policy that has broad participation As I noted, the scale of the opportunity with all the jurisdictions under the cap means more emissions reductions. Also, more participating jurisdictions expand the opportunity for economic development, including by private sector investment in businesses that offer clean transportation solutions. Finally, I would note that what we proposed in the draft MOU is to have a regular program review that will help us evaluate the effectiveness of the program, much like the RGGI program has. So I would say that, again, we're going to welcome public input on where we should be going as we make our decisions about the future of the program, but these are some of the considerations that we've been taking. And again, I encourage people to spend some time with the data that we've presented today and help us figure out the next steps in 2020. Chris, is there anything you'd like to add?
I guess, yeah, so maybe I'll mention flexibility mechanisms here, Marty. I think you'll all see in the draft MOU that it envisions this program would adopt the best practices established by other cap and invest programs, including RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which the Commissioner Subert mentioned, which is the existing cap and invest program for power plants across most of the TCI states. And one of those best practices is including a flexibility in the cap so that it adapts in real time after you've established to real world outcomes, which are always going to be different from what you projected years before when you were designing the program. And so there are these mechanisms within RGGI that I see that explain on the screen here called the Cost Containment Reserve, or CCR, and the Emissions Containment Reserve, or ECR, that automatically adjust the cap in response to allowance prices. So if something unforeseen happens and the program costs more, then the allowance price would rise, and a cost containment reserve would add allowances available to the regional cap to prevent prices from increasing. And then likewise, an equivalent mechanism, which in RGGI is called the Emissions Containment Reserve, where if what would happen in this program could be generally the same thing that has happened in other programs of this type, other cap and invest programs, which is that it ends up costing a lot less than we expect when we're establishing it, which of course would enable a greater level of reduction. So the ECR is a mechanism within RGGI that automatically responds to lower prices by taking advantage of the opportunity they provide to reduce emissions even faster and removing allowances from the cap. So one thing we're interested in input on is how to design those mechanisms, how to incorporate those best practices for a flexible cap into a transportation cap and invest program.
Great. Thanks very much to both of you. This is James again. And I will note that if you like that cartoon, and I do, that you just looked at, there are a few more that are there's a Cap and Invest 101 webinar recorded on the TCI webpage, and you can learn more about those mechanisms and how they might work for this program. So I think there was a couple questions about the stakeholder outreach process and stakeholder engagement and work with the public that's gone on really over the past couple of years particularly, but even longer in many ways. And before turning it over to the states, I want to introduce Vicki Arroyo, Executive Director here at Georgetown Climate Center, to have an initial response.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. Some of you know that some of the large public events that we've held around TCI and a potential regional policy actually started way back in 2017 now around Climate Week and activities here in DC. 2018 brought several listening sessions, 6 of them throughout the region with over 500 stakeholders and 100 state officials participating. A report on our website and the TCI website, cleverly called What We Heard, was released in November of last year and informed the decision to move forward with the policy work this year that was announced a year ago. And then, of course, this year, per that release, the states had committed to doing more public outreach. There were 3 very large regional workshops that also had live streams available in Boston, Newark, and Baltimore. There were 3 webinars. James just referenced one of them, and over 1,000 different people participated in all of those this year, and we've received over 1,200 comments in the portal. And that doesn't include a lot of the meetings that we've been asked to speak at, the states have been asked to speak at, for different diverse constituencies, including everybody from the petroleum interests who might be regulated, the electric utilities who are interested, environmental justice groups, and other NGOs and other diverse stakeholders and people. And the states themselves have been building on processes that in some cases, like in Massachusetts, have gone on for a while. So I'll let you hear directly from some of the states about some of their outreach as well, maybe starting with Marty, because I know Massachusetts has been at this for some time.
Thank you, Vicki. Yeah, we have greatly benefited from having engagement. We have had very active participation. We've had over 11 sessions since this past summer to talk about various aspects of TCI, both before the framework and after the framework was issued. In doing so, we have been trying to make sure that we are thoughtful about the communities affected, that we are recognizing the differences in communities, that we are making sure that we have a process now and moving forward to recognize the needs of communities, the different needs of communities going forward. And so, again, we're looking forward to getting additional input on the draft MOU and the modeling slides, but we've tried to make sure that we have been in communities where around the Commonwealth, and we're committed to in continuing to engage in an active dialogue in the Commonwealth.
Great. Do any other states want to speak up for the activities in your states as well?
This is Carrie in Connecticut. We have been working and collaborating with, similar to Massachusetts, with NGOs and other partners here in Connecticut to start to communicate about what TCI is. In the coming year, through our Governor's Council on Climate Change, we anticipate doing more community-driven outreach. And I would say that we are looking for feedback and input on what folks in Connecticut want that to look like.
James, it's Brian Woods from Vermont, and in addition to similar outreach efforts that we've done within the state, I do want to mention that there's been a continuing discussion about the impact that this program could have, particularly on rural communities, and we did partner with some of our Northeast friends to have a rural seminar focused on this particular program. And got feedback from folks on, how it might work and what would be things that they would like to see, particularly in a rural transportation landscape, or from objective that would allow us to address the issues of people getting around, access to mass transit, and how that might work, and how things might be improved in the context of this kind of a program. So individual state experts, but states are also partnering up to be able to address particular issues that cross state borders.
And we had large listening sessions in Largo as well as Baltimore, which I mentioned earlier as one of the regional sessions this year. And our team has been helping Maryland have additional outreach both in urban and suburban areas as well as rural areas like Easton, Maryland, I know this year.
And Owings Mills.
Owings Mills. New York, not on the phone, but part of the dialogue. Rhode Island and other states have also had their own outreach for the last year or more. So anyway, with that, we'll turn to the next question.
Okay, a number of questions about the fuels that are covered. As we've said, the draft MOU talks about on-road fuels, diesel and gasoline, but there's questions about sort of the status of where things stand on how biofuels would be treated. For example, will there be some sort of carbon intensity metric for biofuels? And also how we do the accounting for electricity. And for example, when looking at emission reductions from electric vehicles, do we factor in the emissions from the electricity generation itself. So maybe Chris, you could start that one off.
Sure. So on the biofuels in the draft MOU, there's a description of the covered fuels, which would be the fossil component of the motor gasoline and on-road diesel. So that would be how emissions are calculated, the emissions associated with the combustion of the fossil component of those fuels. On the electric vehicles, so the tool we have available, NEMS, the National Energy Modeling System, covers energy use across the economy. So it has an electricity component to it, as well as the transportation module, which we've been using to evaluate the transportation sector impacts. And we're still working on the electricity side of the model, making sure that all of the state's electricity-oriented programs are expressed in the model and working correctly, so we can understand and interpret those results on the electricity side. So we hope to start including electricity side impacts in the upcoming rounds of additional modeling in the new year. But in the meantime, what we know is that we have a really substantial set of electricity-oriented programs across the TCI region. Currently 9 of the 12 TCI states are participants in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a carbon cap for power plants. And starting in less than a month, there will be a 10th. And then the 2 remaining TCI jurisdictions, have either declared their intention to begin to participate in RGGI or have already started rulemaking processes to do so. So it's our expectation that in relatively short order, the electricity sector emissions will be capped across the TCI region, certainly by the time the TCI cap would take effect. So we know that we have substantial electricity-oriented programs in place to cap the emissions from electricity generally, and including the incremental emissions that would occur from the additional electricity demand for electric vehicles. And we're still like I said, we're still working on exploring that through the model we have available.
Thanks, Chris. We have a lot of questions to get through, so this is James. We'll keep moving. So there are a couple questions about really getting into the program implementation, less on the modeling and more on how would we do this, how would the states do this in terms of the regulated entities. There in the draft MOU, you will notice there is some description of how the point of regulation would work. And I think I'll start with my colleague Drew Vasey, who is very familiar with the fuel systems. And I think the basic question comes down to how would you avoid double counting or undercounting with so many states small states close to each other and so much fuel crossing between them. And there's another one, of course, is what about fuel coming in from outside the region or leaving the region even, or coming in from Canada, even outside the country? You want to start it off, Drew?
Sure. And from the outset of how the MOU is structured currently around regulated entities is to ensure full coverage of fuels that are destined for combustion in the TCI region. And so the MOU now uses phrasing like position holder and enter, as well as terminal and terminal rack, that the petroleum fuel industry is familiar with. There's a lot of information tracking that goes on. And so you can avoid this sort of double counting in how you structure the reporting forms. And I'll just point you back to the MOU for more detail on that. But we are, the states are asking for more input on these particular details.
Does any of the state officials on the phone want to add anything to that? Thanks, Drew.
So several questions on, also related really more to the MOU than to the modeling. And a couple of people asked about features that are in RGGI and whether those will be in TCI or whether they're being contemplated for TCI. So I guess to sort of summarize the questions, or what features of RGGI are contemplated for the program, and is linking to RGGI still under consideration?
So this is Marty from Marty Suberg. I'll start, and I might invite Georgetown and Chris Hoagland to supplement anything that I might have missed. there are elements. There are certainly a number of elements. We want to learn from the RGGI experience and take the best parts of it. I think as part of the presentation, you heard, obviously, we're thinking about a cap, a declining cap. There's a lot of work to do to figure out how we get there, but we're certainly looking at that, and the models have given some indication about how we might approach that issue, which is similar to how RGGI works. There is a cap and a declining cap. States adopt, what the basic elements of a model rule, so that the market for allowances that a program like this would have could be traded across the jurisdictions covered by it. You heard in several of the slides about some of the tools we use. In addition to having a market and an auction system, there were elements in there to make sure that there is flexibility for compliance. The ability to bank allowances is something we're looking at. The ability of entities to be able to trade allowances between themselves. A cost containment reserve if costs should rise above expected levels. An environmental containment reserve if for other types of eventualities. I think we're looking to make sure that all of those elements, again, that appear to have worked very well in RGGI, are part of this, to make sure that we have a program, an auction program that works effectively, where compliance is easy to understand and implement, and that there are safeguards in place to make sure that the program is working as we would expect it to work. So those would be some of the elements that I think are similar to the RGGI experience. And again, I don't know if anybody from the other states or Georgetown would have anything they'd like to add to that.
No, I think that was a good explanation. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And I think we have had certainly questions about program costs and wanting to better understand from the economic modeling standpoint, how is it that the modeling, given that obviously there's a incremental cost in the price of fuel, how is it that the program ends up with a net economic benefit from a macroeconomic standpoint? I know you went through that in your slides, Chris, a bit, but I think maybe a little bit more kind of explanation to help people understand the specifics of that. And then if maybe Chris, I was going to say Chris Hoagland, and then Chris Porter from Cambridge Systematics might be able to add something on the REMI model itself. And this, I think, will be the last question because we're running out of time and we're going to wrap it up shortly. So go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so quickly, this is Chris Hoagland, and then Chris Porter can explain maybe the details of how that works in REMI. But generally, the incremental gas price change you're seeing in response to the program, that represents the investments in clean transportation options throughout the states. Ordinarily, if the gas price goes up, like for example, you see in the historical chart when the gas price was higher in prior years, that's just gas is more expensive, and that additional expenditure on behalf of consumers and businesses is just going to higher revenues in oil-producing places. This is different. These gas price changes we're looking at here represent investments in clean transportation options in our states, which is a good thing for our states' economies. And maybe Chris Porter can explain some of the dynamics, the positives and negatives that are accounted for in the REMI analysis.
Sure, and we account for both cost increases and cost savings. And some of the increases are obvious, like the gas prices and people spending a little bit more on electric vehicles. But those also result in important cost savings over time as people are spending money on electricity instead of gasoline and diesel for fuel. It's cheaper. Vehicles are more efficient. So people are saving money there. They're saving money on vehicle maintenance because these vehicles cost less to maintain. And then also on the travel demand side, because we're giving people more travel options, there are some people now who are able to travel by transit or by bicycling or walking, who are no longer needing to spend money on the vehicles and gasoline and vehicle repair. And then there's also reduced congestion. And that's important, especially from the business side, because trucks and business travelers are spending less time stuck in traffic. And so that's really, important business cost savings. So, on the balance, when you throw all that together, it does come out to be a net benefit for the regional economy.
Thanks, Chris, and really appreciate that, but to both of you, Chris and Chris. So I think with that, I really want to wrap this up. I want to thank everyone and thank everyone for participating, particularly the state leaders who are on the phone, Commissioner Suberg, Carrie Ann Wright-Cato, Brian Woods, Chris Hoagland, and our consultants who are on the line as well, and my colleagues here for helping to pull all this together. So, and thank all of you for joining the webinar as well.
And then Marty Suberg might want to have some closing remarks from a state's perspective as we sing this webinar out.
Well, thanks for that, and I'll echo Georgetown's thanks, and I will also thank Georgetown for your tremendous work in not only helping us work through these issues, but arranging this forum today. I would just want to highlight again that there is still an opportunity, important opportunities for people to comment on the MOU, to look at, as well as the modeling, and help us design an effective program. So we're very much looking forward to people continuing to comment and engage with us, and we will continue to benefit and make sure that we are appropriately using that input as we move forward with program design. And I believe with that also comes a commitment that we will be transparent with our next steps in 2020. So thank you once again for your time, everybody on this webinar, and again, we look forward to ongoing engagement.
Great. Thank you again so much, Commissioner. And just a final note that the slides from today's webinar will be posted very shortly on the TCI webpage. And if you have more comments or questions that we're not able to address, you can, of course, submit them through the TCI portal on the TCI website. So have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.